This is the post-climate changed world that we're living in. If the West Coast isn't on fire, the East Coast is flooding, and this is only going to get worse. You know, we talk about adaptation, there's a lot you can do, but as Knut, tried to make the point over 1,000 years ago, you can't turn back the sea. You can't turn back these enormous, very powerful Earth systems. And they have the power to kill people.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan. And so another month, another flash flood, this time in Texas, on the Guadalupe River. We're sweeping through a summer camp long favored by the political and economic elite in Texas, Camp Mystic, where generations of daughters of senators, CEOs, and oil heirs went tubing and horseback riding, suddenly under 26 feet of water in 90 minutes. This kind of flash flood, not just hitting the poorer parts of the world, when these events happen to us, is that going to change how we think about the map of the world in ways that all of the other things that we can see happening right now? My guest today is Gaia Vince, who at the Frankfurt Book Festival was described as the first post-climate change author in terms of her fantastic book, Nomad Century, which came out in paperback last year and was one of our books of the year, making the argument that climate migration isn't a crisis to be avoided. It's a transformation that we must embrace. She's also talked about the kind of solutions that are out of the box. We've talked a little bit about imagination deficit disorder on this program. If there's anybody in the world that we could have asked to speak to who does not suffer from IDD, it is Gaia Vince. We're so glad she could join us. Thank you so much for coming on Wicked Problems.
Pleasure, Richard.
Climate has been the threat multiplier, a kind of great displacer. It's always been that way throughout human history. But we have these culturally loaded reactions to it that seem to be becoming more extreme. Do floods like the one we just saw in Texas, before we get into the book itself, I just have to ask because of topicality, how does that fit into the conversation? How does it shift how we talk about these things?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really shows, and it's not the first time, of course, that the rich world is now very vulnerable. Climate change is not something that is over there. It's in the future. It's something we can talk about preventing or anything like that. And unfortunately, it's still the driving narrative that you see, particularly among leadership and among some of the top negotiators. It's a really problematic narrative. Climate change is very much everywhere now. It is a planetary scale issue and it is affecting everyone. The US has had, billions of dollars of damage from disasters, from climate-induced and climate-worsened disasters over every year for the past, I'd say, at least 5 years. It's been really, really problematic. If the West Coast isn't on fire, the East Coast is flooding. And this is only going to get worse because, as you heat the atmosphere, then it holds more moisture, and that moisture doesn't come down as gentle drizzle. It comes down in these very violent flash floods. And we talk about adaptation. There's a lot you can do, but essentially, as Knut tried to make the point over 1,000 years ago, you can't turn back the sea. You can't turn back these enormous, very powerful Earth systems. And they have the power to disrupt lives, to kill people. I mean, it's a horrible situation in Texas. I haven't seen the latest, but, large numbers of children at a summer camp and, householders who are missing, presumed dead. I mean, it's just horrible. And these places are becoming more and more unlivable. We have to think about where we live, and that's in the US. People are already deciding to move. There is already a noticeable amount of climate migration within US borders. But of course, the current administration is not making any of this easier. This kind of the climate denial, the cutting of funds from disaster relief agency FEMA, the cutting of funds and positions in climate modeling and weather forecasting. If you don't know about it, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Forewarned is forearmed, and it's really tragic seeing these very obvious obviously worsened disasters playing out, from across the Atlantic. It's horrible.
I mean, for me, what's interesting sitting here in the UK, as you are, does this get cut through in ways that other stories don't? And I guess that's, again, we could talk
Well,
about
I
whether
mean,
that's good or bad.
we started this year, if you remember. I mean, this has
Yeah.
been like another of those years that seems to have gone on for centuries. But we
Yes.
started this year in January in the Northern Hemisphere winter with wildfires causing across
Los Angeles.
Angeles.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, we saw the most celebrated famous climate refugees, people like Paris Hilton. And obviously, there is huge inequality in and inequity in the disaster itself and in how the recovery takes place. But this was front page news because this is the most expensive real estate in the planet being reduced to rubble. I mean, the site there it's apocalyptic. Even now, it's just unbelievable. It looks like after a tsunami or one of these very, very disruptive natural events. And it was a natural event, but of course it was predicated on human activity. So we heated the atmosphere to make a wildfire much, much more likely in January. We were the ones that built in inappropriate materials near inappropriate planted forests. All of these issues sort of came together in this absolute disaster zone. And people are, I'm not crying tears over homeless Paris Hilton. Obviously, she's got many other places to live. But there are plenty of people there who are still homeless and who can't afford, to move to another palace. It's a really, really volatile upheaval that we're facing this century. And I'm not sure that the fundamental truth of what we're facing as a planetary population was really infused in that story of individual disasters that are occurring in the US. It was everywhere on the news, but was that really woven together to make sense to people of we are now living in a different time? This is the post-climate changed world that we're living in.
And I think for me, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about why you decided to write this book. And for me, I mean, I've been enormously frustrated since we started this project a couple of years ago, with and one of the reasons I found your book so bracing and so wonderful is that, just kind of like the world is presenting us with these facts. If you are coming at them with any kind of grace of wanting to see, like, how can we avoid needless suffering and have better outcomes for people, there are certain things we need to face up to and need to do. And yet we seem congenitally unable to do that. I mean, I love the fact that you end the book with the manifesto, Nomad Century, of these 8 points, right? And the number one of which is people relocating has always been a natural survival behavior. Like, this is just normal. And it's either animals or plants, as you said, and as well as humans. And yet we, in 2025, even more than when you wrote the book, seem to be considering migration as a threat, as invasion, as something that requires concentration camps to be built in the Everglades in Florida, or migrant boats coming across the channel to be stabbed with daggers to deflate the boat. It seems to be heading in a direction that we seem to be going further and further away from the recognition of what seems painfully obvious when you read your book. Why is that?
Yeah, it's true, and it's to do with the narrative that's been presented. We have been sold this narrative insidiously through, it originates with populist and right-wing politicians, but it's infused throughout the media. This idea that a lot of our problems are have a cause in immigration or are linked to immigration in some way, whether it's cost of living or the housing crisis or employment, unemployment, all of these issues. And this is a confected narrative, um, we are living in much more volatile times. Some of that is down to climate change, the cost of climate change. The cost of living, essentially, which is tied to our energy systems, which is tied to food availability, harvest failures. Even commodity transfer. When the Panama Canal was drought struck, there was a shortage of goods, which led to price increases. I mean, all of this is woven. Plus, we're spending huge amounts of money clearing up these billion-dollar disasters. Excuse me. All of these factors are these sort of complex global issues that come to play in national politics. And the fact that the far right and populist leaders who reduce complexity. Populism is all about the reduction of complexity to slogans, to very simplified policies which don't stand up. I mean, none of these populist leaders can actually functionally lead in a positive way, but they're very popular because people like to see something easy that they can, and the promises of populism are that this one thing will solve your all your problems, whatever it is. And so we see that, and then we see the centrist and left-wing parties sort of trying to chase those votes by sort of cosplaying or being the cover version of the original candidates. And as if you have the choice between the actual artist or the cover version, everyone's going to go for the actual artist. So it's a really foolish way of chasing those far right votes. It's completely it doesn't work, as we've seen across Europe, across everywhere it's been tried. It's much better to weave a much more pragmatic and realistic narrative, which really looks at the situation and looks at the issues that are there. And I think, for example, the Spanish leader has done something similar there. So the Spanish leader last year said to the citizens, look, we can either go along the whole anti-immigrant thing that a lot of European governments are doing, or we can be honest and say, we want to grow our economy, we want to be a stronger country, and that takes an increased labor force, it takes immigration. And how do we make that work? How do we make sure that that wages don't decrease with this, which they generally don't anyway, but how can we also be sure that the immigrants don't arrive and are a sort of second class, underclass population, that they're trapped in meaningless low value, low wage jobs and all of that? How do we? And they've put lots of policies in place, and Spain has seen the highest rise in GDP because of this policy. They've also seen minimum wage rise by 50%. They've done all sorts of things to be pragmatic, essentially, about immigration, about this human movement, which is anyway taking place. And, nations will be competing for migrants, over the coming years, because just because of the falling birth rate, let alone all the other things we have.
100%. And I want to come back to that in just a moment, because but to restate the main core argument, the thesis of your book in Nomad Century, right? So essentially, like, migration has always happened. Right. This has always been an adaptation strategy by humans and other species.
We're all the products of migration, of course.
We're all the products, right? 100%, right? So, and again, we tell each other sometimes stories that pretend that that's not true, but that's fundamentally scientifically, and your background is in science. It's something that you simply you have to really do a lot of work to avoid coming to that conclusion. And in fact, I think you say at one point, like, one of the reasons we're having so many species, extinctions at the moment in terms of biodiversity is the fact that we have restricted the ability of a lot of species because of road building, because of cities, because of urbanization, because of whatever. We've interrupted the normal migratory patterns that would have allowed for further adaptation, which has hastened the decline and extinction of some particular species. So, surprise, surprise, do that with humans. Guess what's going to happen? Hey-ho. But look, I wanted to, just basically the idea, it's always been this way in that people have always, and species have always migrated. Two, because of how we've changed the climate, because of fossil fuel emissions, to unprecedented in the human experience levels of carbon, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. That's going to lead, depending on which numbers you believe, could be up to 3 billion people in 2070, according to one study you cite, which at that point will be 30%
So,
of the human population having to move from places that are no longer livable. Is that right?
so that study that you're talking about was a study looking at the human climate, the shift in the human climate niche, and that's really the niche which all of our civilizations have been built at. So that's where all of our agriculture, our cereal crops, our vegetable crops, and everything have been bred to flourish at that temperature and those conditions, and the same with our building materials and the water supplies, all of those things. So that's going to shift, and that's where around a third of the population live. Now, whether a third of the population is going to move, and remember, by the latter part of the century, we're talking about a population of some 9 to 10 billion people. Whether they will all move, it depends on all sorts of things. It depends on our adaptive ability. It depends on, how much adaptation we're doing. And pretty much no one is doing anywhere near any sort of adaptation for the already changed circumstances that we live through. And it depends, of course, on our mitigation strategies, which again are wildly inadequate. So those people will live outside of the human niche, whether they migrate to safety, whether they die tragically, whether they move to more adapted habitats. Who knows? But that's a very serious problem that we face, and one that we should be absolutely planning for and looking at ways to manage it rather than pretending it doesn't exist,
I mean, it feels to me, and you tell me whether or not this is your experience. It feels to me that since you wrote the book, our public narratives, I don't know if you have. I know that you speak a lot to people who are involved in planning in the background, and hopefully you're going to tell me I shouldn't be so worried because they're living in the real world. But our public narratives seem to be further and further away from grasping and dealing with that reality that you describe in the book and what is so obviously coming, and pretending that it's not going to happen, pretending that we're simply going to be able to ignore it, whether it be the need for mitigation, whether it be the need to understand that humans are just going to keep going where they're going to be able to live better, whether we resist it or not, or try to figure out a way to make it, like Spain, beneficial to what we're trying to do. How do you reconcile that? How do you think about that compared to when you wrote this, compared to what you're seeing now? It feels like there was like a crossroads we were at, like post-pandemic. You're writing during the pandemic. We come out of the pandemic, and it's like, well, we could choose to grasp these issues and deal with these, challenges in ways that might benefit us in the long term, or we might just retreat into la la land. And what seems to have happened is the latter choice.
Yeah, I do see a sort of lack of engagement in a lot of these issues and a pushback. And, I don't think that's coming from citizens. I don't think it's coming from people at all. And many of these are on the front line, of course, of these changes. They're being flooded out of their homes. They're being, they're suffering unbearable heat. We've just had shocking heat waves across Europe, which have been deadly in some cases, and will undoubtedly lead to, an increased death toll. I think it was more than 60,000 last year in Europe died of heat. So I don't think it's coming from people, but I do think that what is happening is the far right, the populists, are very anti any attempts to, they don't like net zero, they don't like any attempts to transform our energy systems, they don't like any green initiatives at all. And I think those actually, and they are gaining in popularity, but while those policies are not, people don't vote right wing because of their environmental policies. They're actually very low priority for their voters. What other parties are seeing is, oh, people are voting for people are tempted or are thinking about voting for parties that don't like green policies. And I think again there's been a narrative failure. I actually think that the Inflation Reduction Act that Biden brought in was a classic example of a really well thought out policy which prioritized, job security, building, transformation, the economy. Whereas what it was really doing was also environmentally sustainable, because that is, these two are not fighting each other. These two are, it's absolutely predicated on that. If you're going to go down an economic policy that is environmentally damaging, you're ultimately damaging your economy, of course, because that's what, the economy is based on. But people don't recognize that. So I think that was actually quite a successful strategy. Obviously, the guy in charge at the moment, he's specifically targeting any policy that came from Biden just for some sort of like personal vendetta. Incredibly childish, but it's also very damaging for the US economy, right? So it's foolish. And I think what we're seeing is, Republicans in Republican states, who may have voted for him, actually fighting back against some of this because they can see just how costly it's going to be.
Well, I suppose time will tell on that one. I hope that's right. But I guess it's what I'm amazed at is watching the capacity of people to work against their own interests. Even when things are clearly.
I mean, that is amazing. Yeah, it's.
So it's something that. But look, I mean, we could spend all the time on that. I don't want to do that because I think your book is more interesting in the sense that it lifts up our gaze from, the utterly depressing minutiae of the moment to the idea that like it is possible to think big thoughts in ways that people have had difficulty doing really recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's a solutions focused book.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, I start from what I think needs stating, which is the honest place that we actually are in, because I think there is a lot of dishonesty from leadership about the scale of the problem, the scale of the climate crisis already today, let alone in the centuries to come, but also, there's the issue of human mobility, that it is a reality and that it's not going away and it is going to increase. And if you start from those points, then, you have a solid foundation of reality rather than fantasy thinking to build the future that you want. And so I sort of build the solutions with that knowledge. And I think that's why I wrote it, because I don't think that is happening at all, which seems incredible.
I guess, again, I don't want to make you sad or more depressed about it, but it does seem like it's become more that way. But look, I've spent a lot of time on that, so I won't keep going on that particular topic. But I wanted to ask about who's getting things right. I mean, so like, is anybody getting this right? We talked a little bit before we started recording about this recent news that last month, for the first time anywhere in the world, right, Australia has started issuing visas to a certain number of people in Tuvalu, a small island state, who can apply for these climate visas that don't classify them as refugees, don't classify the people who receive them as anything other than like, you will allow 280 people per year to get residency to come from Tuvalu to Australia. And without getting into all the weird complexity of that deal, it does seem like it's unprecedented in its particular form of having this explicit international agreement where, yeah, for complicated reasons, and we're not going to assume liability, but because we know that things are about to go really sideways, and we have land, and you have people who need land to live on that's going to remain dry, we're going to allow a certain amount of you over the next 10, 20 years to move here, explicitly because of the effects of climate change, which does seem to be unprecedented. How do we think about that? And is it a precedent?
Well, I mean, it is, it's there have been various forms of these sorts of agreements,
Yeah,
but because to allow people to come, and by the way, the Australian economy will be benefiting from these populations,
100%.
of course. It's not, it's not. It's often described as this great like
It's charity,
generosity,
right?
but
Yeah,
it's not, right?
the self-interest.
Developed
Yeah,
economies absolutely need workers. It's an absolute drop in the ocean, isn't it? It's tiny, tiny, tiny amounts. A few hundred people,
yeah,
as opposed to the hundreds of millions that will be moving. But I think, it's a snapshot into what we face, because when
right.
this offer was made, over a third of the population of Tuvalu actually applied for this visa. I mean, just imagine how desperate a people must be for a third of their citizenship to move. I mean, we are talking about a tiny population, which is very dependent actually anyway on Australia for aid, for security, for all sorts of logistics. I mean, it's really very small. It has a very small economy. I think it comes with these the agreement that Australia will have a say on Tuvalu's kind
That's
of
right.
security arrangements.
Security
So
arrangements,
that's
fishing
already,
rights, mineral rights, yeah, all sorts of other things that are again like
yeah. So that
they
is
are.
a huge imposition of its sovereignty,
Yeah,
and this is a big issue, right?
right,
Because what are you a citizen of if you stay in Tuvalu?
right.
Anyway, are you already a citizen of Australia? Because if another country has that much jurisdiction over your resources, your
Mm.
security, all sorts of other issues, are you actually, which country are you a citizen of? And where does sovereignty of a nation end? I was in talks actually with the UNHRC and another UN agency who are looking at, what happens to citizenship when your land territory disappears, right?
Mm.
Which is what a lot of these low-lying island states are in danger of and already experiencing. That's Tuvalu, Maldives, you name it. There are a lot of small island states. How do you manage that? Do you give everybody dual citizenship of a safer country so that they have rights to move? Do you issue some sort of United Nations citizenship? Do other nations kind of get rights if they take your people, rights over your territory? Because territory is quite interesting, because the territory extends beyond your actual land to cover
Mm-hmm.
things like fishing rights. We're talking deep sea mining in various
Exactly.
places. That's very lucrative for various
And so,
interests. So how is that going to work? And these are the sorts of things we need to be discussing
mm,
pragmatically. And I would just add that starting to make these agreements is really essential. So however limited and however problematic this
right,
agreement is between Tuvalu and Australia, it's really important to realise that instead of having to evacuate an entire population in an emergency because of a disaster, if you
mm,
have a plan in place and you're doing it much more gradually, it is so much better for the humans, the
yeah,
future generations. No one wants to be evacuated and then live in tents in a center in some other nation, absolutely dependent on them, unable to work, unable to better themselves. And that is the situation we're seeing, for example, in the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya, where
right,
Sudanese and Somali refugees who have had chronic drought, who are there because they're essentially climate refugees, and they have ended up as prisoners. They have no citizenship, no rights in Kenya. They're not unable to work. They have no papers. They have nothing. They're dependent on inadequate aid. And this is going on for generations. And that is not a solution, to just imprison people, imprison climate refugees, right?
I, I think that unfortunately we seem to be seeing more of that rather than less in the tendency, and I guess that's for me what's worrying. But I think to your point, one of the things I loved about the book is how clear-eyed it is about, for at least, even if the main discourse, if you like, isn't going to support having these conversations. They need to be happening at whatever level is possible in order to be able to like create the intellectual superstructure that's going to support future efforts. You know, because eventually somebody's going to figure out that we can no longer just not do this, and someone's going to look for the playbook. And you've helped to write the playbook, or at least ask the questions that help other people write the playbook. Because you talk about it's over time. If you have massive migrations happening as the result of a one singular natural disaster, you do get these situations that are horrific and long time. But even in the U.S., like in Louisiana, right, there's one town that decided to relocate to the interior from the coast, the Marshall Coast, which is just sinking. It's a 20-year program. There are communities in Wales and Alaska, but it's a 20, 30-year plan, and it's not free. But how do you do that? And I guess what I'm, having read your book, wondering what you think of the pace of, what you say. And I agree with you. Obviously, it's important that these agreements, however small, get started. As we look towards COP30 later this year, as we look towards, the ruling for the advisory opinion expected to come out from the International Court of Justice, which is going to touch on some of these issues. What are you looking for that will accelerate this conversation, even if, my home country, the States, has to be not part of it at the moment, for reasons which we don't need to get into, which are pretty obvious. But like, how do we continue to actually figure some of this stuff out in an environment that's not always conducive to doing that in these spaces?
Yeah, I mean, we need more honest dialogue. It needs to be more inclusive, right? Of people actually, you know, even though these like specific little examples of various relocations have become quite well known, there are lots and lots of people who are relocating. Insurers are pulling out of entire states because the insurance industry, has to look at the disaster risk, and it's too expensive, right? So they're pulling out, and so people are getting stuck because they can't sell their homes, they can't insure them, and their whole town, village economy is going down because the wealthy businesses that can afford to move out have moved out. And so we're already seeing this translation. We're seeing this relocation within nations in the rich world, as well, of course, as nations in the poor world. I mean, I think the most expensive disaster was last year, I think, was natural disaster, was Emilia Romagna, the wealthiest part of Italy. This is the bit of Italy that produces pretty much all of its economic output. And it's extremely climate exposed, disaster exposed. And that's a huge issue. And, there's a climate denier in government, Maloney, and that's a problem. They're trying to push through, or they have pushed through, a new law of insuring your property. But it's inadequate and people can't afford it, and it's a huge problem. And where do people move to? How do they move? They also, it's all wrapped up, of course, in migration as well, because these businesses need more workers, so they need more immigrants, and they have a performatively hostile anti-migration policy from Maloney, who, of course, at the same time is actually bringing in enormous numbers of immigrants to work, because otherwise the economy would grind to a halt. So, I mean, it's all ridiculous. And there is this huge lack of honesty. And I think it starts, for example, with forgetting this constant narrative we've had from leaders at COP and leaders everywhere saying, we can still stay below 1.5 if we do. What? What?
So,
You know,
okay.
it's
I'm
time
so,
to put that baby to bed, okay? Because we've already had a full year above 1.5, and that doesn't mean that globally the average temperature long term is above 1.5, but it's a very, 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 very clear indicator that that is the way we're going. We're not going to stay below 1.5 by the end of the century. You know, we're increasingly pushing through, you know, the path to 2 degrees and over. We need to get real with our conversation, be honest about the scale of climate disasters and how they are happening and how they cross borders, right?
hmm.
You know, a
So, I mean,
river in full flood doesn't stop at the border and say, I don't have a visa. You know, fire in Canada, the aerosols that cause lung damage are crossing thousands of kilometers of Atlantic and causing respiratory problems in Europeans. We have food harvest failures in India causing price rises in everywhere, Europe, but of course in India as well. I mean, these are planetary scale problems, and it's time that leaders got a grip and started talking honestly about the scale of the issue and how we need to start talking about realistic solutions rather than denying that this is even really much of a problem.
I'm so glad you said that, because
Minor
I think,
rant.
no, because again, I think it's something that, people who have listened to me rant on this subject before, would find that somewhat familiar, because I do think it is the challenge of our times. The times that, like, the science is clear, the solutions of technology are clear. The inability to communicate about this stuff honestly, and therefore to base policy decisions and other decisions based on reality, is where we're absolutely stuck. And so that's one of the things I found so refreshing about the book and about your public talking afterwards, is this need for this honesty. And we talk about, in this conversation, we've given a lot of stick to, people on the populist right, who do propagate these narratives about, like, well, it's either not real or it doesn't matter. It's going to happen to someone else, happen in the future, and blah, 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 it doesn't matter. But I mean, we were talking, well, I was looking at this weekend. We're talking on Monday, the 7th of July. But over the weekend, the Canadian environmentalist David Suzuki made some comments to a news outlet where he said it's too late to avoid some of the most catastrophic elements of climate change, which, and therefore we must focus more adaptation, and that probably will have to mean more people locally looking after each other. And this was met on the climate centrist, climate left online as being, this absolutely horrible thing. How dare you boomer, step up and say, like, you just, I'm sorry that you're tired, but, like, you're saying we're giving up. And that's not what he said. The headline said it's too late. And I think, to your point, if we're already in this post shift, I think you use the donkey's back analogy with the straw on the donkey's back a lot, with the idea, like, we move from one state to another, right? It's not a linear. It's like we're just X, Y. Sometimes the shift happens, and there's no
Yeah.
going back. And the point is, like, if we've already passed the point of no return on some of these tipping points, and we seem to have done, then pretending that we don't have to deal with the consequences of that, which so many people, regardless of their political affiliation or even their scientific knowledge, seem so emotionally and psychologically committed to not facing up to, that they want to shoot the messenger in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Because again, truth telling, honesty, in theory, yes, but the consequences are, even people who should know better, or kind of you think are on the same team, and you look behind you and they're putting knives in your back or arrows in your back.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously get a lot of this. Yeah. You know,
How do you deal with it?
I
How do you
love
keep going?
fairy stories. I think they're brilliant in their place.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when it comes to people's actual lives, I think it's time we kind of got real about where we are. And, being honest about the scale of what we face doesn't mean we've given up. Of course not. What it
Mhm.
means is we're looking honestly at where we are and seeing where we can go from there. And there is a lot we can do. But if we deny we're even in that place, what the hell are we doing? And it's all words. All of this culture war is about words. And sort of fighting each other in these imaginary wars. And I don't need that at all. I think it's much more important that we look at the models and what they're saying. And some of them are actually really frightening about accelerated warming recently, about the sensitivity of the climate to carbon dioxide concentration, about projections for energy rollouts and what we're actually doing in terms of our industrial plans, which could easily derail a lot of the intended kind of renewable transition. There are all sorts of things that are incredibly worrying, and because of this, we should be adapting everywhere already, and we're not. I mean, even in probably the most adapted nation, which is the Netherlands, which has been doing it for centuries, they're not ready for extreme heat, for example, which they've been experiencing. They're much better on flood protection than pretty much anywhere else I've been, but that needs work, right? Because this is unprecedented. And yet
Scale
what
challenge,
we are seeing is not a kind of gentle iteration. We're going to be seeing these huge step changes. And that is true for, one of the reasons also I wrote this book about migration, climate migration, is because these two fields are very separate. So on one side, we have the kind of physical scientists who deal with,
atmospheric
the
chemistry,
systems.
whatever.
Yeah. And they can see how, looking from the past, they can look forward and see that there are potential tipping points. There are cascades where one event leads to another, and you get these feedbacks, and a lot of which are not factored actually into the climate models. And we're seeing the results of some of these now, with much more intense ocean heat, for example. And then the sort of human systems, the migration, that is dealt with by development, by social scientists and so on. And they sort of see climate as, one of the pressures, along with conflict, along with these very separate issues. And they sort of see maybe that might iteratively step up a bit, but they don't see that there's, that there are also tipping points there, and sort of step changes in how immigration and migration work. Just as there's a war and suddenly you get millions displaced from Ukraine or from Syria or wherever, you get these sudden large volumes. That is true for climate, but on a far, far greater scale, because we're not talking about discrete little conflicts. We're talking about multiple harvest failures over large areas of the globe occurring at the same time to people who have been multiply displaced and who are very hungry. So, that there isn't the capacity necessarily in our food at the moment. There isn't, but even if we try and build up that adaptive capacity, which is what I'm trying to talk about, there isn't that capacity to redistribute and to build resilience into our to have the resilience already in our food systems to manage these massive failures at the same time. And that comes with all sorts of other issues as well.
And so again, you, as you described, the book is a book of solutions. And I think again, one of the things I love the fact that Kim Stanley
Having
Robinson
depressed everybody.
No. I think you have to, it's like, I don't know, I think of it like basic training. Someone goes in the military, right? Someone goes in the army, right? The first step in the army training is to break down your existing conceptions of the world in order to build you back up into something useful, right? So if you're, and we can all think about whether that's good or bad, but the point is, like, it's not a unusual human ritual to go through of development to figure out, like, you need to deconstruct the way you see the world and actually see it as it is, or see it in a different way in order to move forward to actual solutions and actually doing something. And I think that your focus on honesty and the need to actually face things as they are, which is, people do resist. And again, I appreciate I'm keeping you over time. So if you got a couple more minutes, 2 more minutes, that would be great. Because I'm going to close on this, which is that the solutions that you then put out there is, like, we shouldn't be limiting the conversations that we're having about the solutions that might be necessary, whether that be cloud brightening, I think you've spoken about positively about, or whether it be things that are, carbon dioxide removal, or indeed these ideas like entirely new cities in Canada, Alaska, Greenland, other places, in the northern and Siberia, the northern hemisphere. 5 years ago, that was like something that Kim Stanley Robinson was putting in his books. How closer do you think we are to actually having, interestingly, perhaps from an unexpected, part of the political spectrum, where people seem to be injecting this into the dialogue in surprising ways, of like, hey, let's take over Greenland, or if you're Peter Thiel, hey, let's have some charter cities.
Yeah, this is exactly what, because I think a lot of this is going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
All right, because these are solutions that I'm not the only person to come up with, and they are the solutions where it makes sense to put money into, to invest in, and all of this. I'm not going to be the only person on this, and what we are at risk of doing is not talking about any of this and having individuals, billionaires, companies, and investors that are not democratically elected, that do not represent citizens, and are not regulated, and are not doing things in the parameters that we have decided makes them socially acceptable, environmentally acceptable, etc., just going ahead and doing it anyway. And that, I think, is the worst of all worlds. That really is a disaster. So I say, talk about these now. Talk about how we would manage it, what rules we would apply, what compensation we would apply if there are negative effects, how we would spread benefits, how we would ensure that everybody is carried along with this, how we would what the parameters of these different actions might be, so that how reversible they are, if that was something we felt more comfortable with. All of these issues we can only decide upon if we decide with our eyes open and we make those discussions. It doesn't mean we go ahead with them. The contrary, it means we decide if and when we go ahead with them, rather than individuals deciding randomly that that's where they want to, what they want to do and where they want to move to, which is absolutely abhorrent to me.
And final question, you call it book for global governance, and the idea that it needs to be this, again, to your point, rather than have individual actors go off and like do a patchwork quilt of, of a dictatorship over here, and maybe there's a socialist one over here, and maybe there's a democratic one over here, and maybe there's, one that does cannibalism over here. Like you're saying, like the reason we need global governance on this stuff is to avoid some of the worst outcomes that will result from that kind of anarchy. It feels a little further away maybe than when you wrote it, so that we might be looking at that. Or please give me where are you looking to be more hopeful about that being a potential outcome, whether it's not right around the corner, obviously, but like in terms of the conversations that you might be having with policymakers behind the scenes, that give you some indication that, like,
I think it's true that globally we feel very much more torn apart. The United Nations organizations, which were set up, if you remember, after the world had been torn apart by devastating wars, we had unprecedented migration, we had entire cities destroyed, nations literally at war with each other. They were set up with these really great ideals, these values in place to eliminate polio, for example, to eliminate smallpox, which was successfully done. A World Food Programme, a United Nations, Human Rights Act, refugees, all of these sorts of things. And that was great. And, over the years, we've grown very complacent about a lot of these issues. We now have planetary scale crises, and they truly are planetary scale. And the response must be, they demand a planetary scale response. And I think we need planetary scale governance to deal with a lot of these issues. And one of the reasons is because of the scale of and how kind of holistic it is of the globe. But another reason is because, at the moment, many of these decisions are limited by this sort of like short-termist political time frame. So one leader can come in and completely undo the activity of another in these very planetary scale issues. So, for example, we now have the United States outside of the global climate agreements. We have, this doesn't work. The World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, all of these things. So we need them to be kind of, above this kind of petty timetable. And I think, there are different ways of doing this. Costa Rica, for example, embedded, and this was a political decision, embedded nature protection and conservancy within the constitution. So as different leaders come in, it's very hard to roll back any of these nature protection things because you have to undo bits of the constitution. And so they haven't been undone. And that has allowed, over the last few decades, nature, first of all, to be really restored, a reversal of deforestation, but also to be at the bedrock of the economy. So that's really worked, and that's been really helpful. But none of these issues can be solved by individual nations. They have to be solved collaboratively, and so I think we need governance structures for that. We need political structures. There's a conference in London actually in August that's just being arranged at the moment on global governance at Birkbeck. So that looks to be interesting, looking at how this sort of thing might be set up and what how it would work.
Well, I hope we can cover that when it becomes appropriate to do so. But Gaia Vince, again, you've been so generous with your time. Nomad Century is the book. Again, came out in paperback last year, but you can get it at all the good bookshops. It's on our UK bookshop.org list of books that you should definitely get from our authors, people we've spoken to and people we hope to speak to in the future. Gaia Vince, thank you so much for joining us in Wicked Problems.
Thanks, Richard. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.